ancient biblical prophets wrote about the future. Today, theologians are poring over those scriptures with a firm belief that their prophecies are coming to pass. Journey now into the world of eschatology on Prophecy in the News with author and lecturer J.R. Church.
Moses wrote 5 books: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. This design that Moses laid out in these first 5 books have been followed through other writings of the Bible. For example, there are 5 books of the Psalms corresponding to these 5 books of Moses. And we have talked about the 5 books of the Psalms on past programs. Lamentations has 5 chapters. Jeremiah wrote those 5 chapters to illustrate the Torah design, the Genesis chapter, the Exodus chapter, the Leviticus chapter, the Numbers chapter, and the Deuteronomy chapter. We have in times past talked to you about Matthew and its Pentateuchal design. Well, we've come across another, what I feel is an absolutely astounding design of the book of Genesis itself. As Moses penned the 50 chapters of Genesis, he literally laid it out in 10 Pentateuchal designs. Now, the word Pentateuch is a nice Greek word, and in the front of my Bible, the 5 books of Moses here are described as the Pentateuch. But you know, I think we ought to call it what it is, the Torah designs of Scripture. And Gary Stearman is here to discuss with me what I think is going to be a fascinating program.
It will be fascinating, and we don't have nearly enough time to talk about everything. I'm sure this one will be continued. The Torah simply means law in Hebrew, the books of Moses. J.R., the 5 books of Moses are held by the Jews to be absolutely without error of any kind. Now, Jews generally hold to the divine origin of Scripture, the inspiration, but of the Torah, they believe in the literal letter by letter by letter inspiration.
Yes.
In the exact form in which it's been laid out for centuries. And so this Torah, these 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, could be the key to the entire Bible. And as we look at them today, I think we're going to see one of the ways in which they are a literal key.
It's got to be, Gary. It's got to be. In the book of Genesis, we find the beginnings. We find creation. We find a problem defined. We find the fall of man, the ages of the promise, corresponds with Aleph, which has basically the same meaning. Exodus refers to redemption, usually the crossing of a water, which has spiritual overtones as well. A covenant, a marriage, bait, a house, a home. The letter bait is the second letter, meaning a house. It stands for division, stands for removal, and so on. Gimel is the third letter and corresponds with Leviticus. In the book of Leviticus, we see spiritual dimension. We see worship, contact with God. We see sanctification. And this is all basically one definition, not several definitions here. When we get to the book of Numbers, we see trial and struggle, testing. We see the way, and the way is a difficult way on the way to the promised land, shall we say. In Deuteronomy, corresponding with the hay, we see the summary of it all. We see divine government established, the final judgment, the Holy Spirit. And all of these things tell a story. And Gary, that's where the book of Genesis enters.
Well, J.R., they tell the story of grace, and it's fascinating. There are 5 of these books, and 5 has long been held by Christian theologians to be exemplary of grace. Grace begins with the work of God, and it ends with the work of God, and the beginning of God's work is called the creation. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, Genesis 1:1.
Amazing. Now, if we were to take chapter 1, we find that corresponds to the meaning of Genesis. Then if we take chapter 6, chapter 11, chapter 16, chapter 21, chapter 26, these are all Genesis chapters. All the way through the 50 chapters, we have these 5 books listed. So there's chapters 1, 6, 11, 16, 21, 26, 31, 36, 41, and 46, and they are Genesis chapters.
In other words, what you're saying is that there's a repetitive design. Chapter 1 of Genesis conforms to Genesis.
Yeah.
Chapter 2 would be Exodus. Chapter 3 would be formed after Leviticus, chapter 4 after Numbers, and chapter 5 after Deuteronomy, and then they would rotate and start again.
That's
chapter
right.
6 would be then a Genesis book.
Yes.
And you take these 5 at a time.
7 would be Exodus.
7 Exodus.
8 would be Leviticus. 9 would be Numbers. 10 would be Deuteronomy, and it starts over again through the entire 50.
So you're saying there's a rotational design
Yes.
to Genesis.
Now, when you really see this, and of course, we've seen it for the first time, all over again. Look, we spent 4 programs a few years ago on the designs of Genesis, the alphabetic designs of Genesis. But we touched upon the idea of the Pentateuchal design, this Torah design, the 5s, but we didn't see it back then.
That's
we
right.
see it now. We see it now. I want to share it with you, and it's really incredible. So we've got all of these Genesis chapters, 1, 6, 11, 16, 21, 26, 31, 36, 41, and 46. And we want to go through a few of these and give you an idea of what we're talking about.
Okay, now to begin, and I want to make sure that everyone is following us, in this rotational design, the theme of Genesis is beginnings, creation, the definition of the problem of redemption, the fall, the promise, but in essence, we're talking about something beginning. And let's just use that as our key word. The verse 1 of chapter 1 says, "In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth." So this is our theme.
Yeah.
Now we would expect to find this theme repeated over and over again.
Right. So in chapter 6, we have plans for a new beginning through Noah. For you see, fallen angels have polluted the human gene pool. The Lord appears to Noah and he says, "At the end of all flesh has come before me, for all the earth is filled with violence through them. Behold, I will destroy them with the earth. Make thee an ark of gopher wood." And Noah prepares for a new beginning. That's a Genesis chapter.
Okay, so Genesis 1 says, "In the beginning God created the heaven and the earth." Here, then, there's a new beginning. And by the way, we find in this chapter Noah finding grace in the eyes of the Lord. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
That's the beginning.
That's the Pentateuchal design, grace.
Grace.
5.
Yeah.
The number of grace. And in chapter 11 is another new beginning through Abraham. That's, the chapter begins with idolatry at the Tower of Babel. The Lord announces a new beginning. He says, "Let's confound their language, they may not understand one another's speech." And so he in that chapter gives us the ancestry of Abraham. So that's another new beginning, you see. That's another Genesis chapter. When we get to chapter 16, we have the beginning of the Arabs through the birth of Ishmael. This is a new beginning. This is something introduced for the first time, you see. It's a whole new story introduced in the book of Genesis. This one with Ishmael. The angel of the Lord appears to Hagar and announces the new beginning. He says he'll be a wild man. His hand will be against every man, and every man's hand against him. In chapter 21, we have the beginning of the promised lineage through the birth of Isaac. So in chapter 16, we have the birth of Ishmael. In chapter 21, we have the birth of Isaac, another Genesis chapter. And then in chapter 26, we have the Abrahamic covenant confirmed to Isaac. So this is the next step from the covenant that he made with Abraham. We have a new beginning here as the next generation takes this new covenant.
Yeah, the conferring of power from Abraham to Isaac, which does constitute a new beginning. So this theme then is rotating all the way through the book of Genesis.
Then in chapter 31, the Lord appears to Jacob, calls him back to Bethel. That's a new beginning. He says, "I am the God of Bethel, where thou anointest the pillar, and where thou vowedest a vow unto me. Now arise, get thee out from this land, and return unto the land of thy kindred." There's a new beginning in the life of Jacob. And then in chapter 36, the beginning of Esau's lineage. And at 41, there's a new beginning for Joseph. He's exalted to rule over Egypt. Chapter 46, the Lord appears to announce a new beginning for Jacob. He says, I am God, the God of thy father. Fear not to go down into Egypt, for I will make thee there a great nation. I'll go down with thee into Egypt, and I will also surely bring thee up again. So isn't it amazing, Gary? All of these chapters, 1, 6, 11, 16, 21, 26, 31, 36, 41, and 46, all offer new stories, new themes, the beginnings.
50 chapters in Genesis. 10 times we rotate through these themes of 5. That results in a total of 50, and I think it's very interesting. The total number of these is 10. Ordinal perfection.
Yeah,
God's perfection shows through this design.
No wonder he picked Jubilee to be the 50th number, you know.
Yeah.
There's more. We'll be back in just a moment. In the first half of this program, we have looked at the Torah designs of the book of Genesis, and we have covered the Genesis chapters. Gary, let's talk about the Exodus chapters now, because they are equally powerful here.
Okay, if Genesis would be chapter 1, then Exodus would be chapter 2, and then rotationally, every 5 chapters thereafter. And so Genesis chapter 2 talks about the establishment of the heavens and the earth and the creation of man. And by the way, the story of man being placed in the Garden of Eden.
And to me, this is fascinating because Exodus refers to the establishment of a home, a house, a dwelling place, a provision. It speaks of redemption. It also has something to do with water. And I think that's a metaphor there, a spiritual metaphor that's fascinating. Take, for example, in the 2nd chapter here, you talk about God providing the Garden of Eden for Adam and Eve to live in. He also talks about Eve, the wife. So here's the establishment of the home, the duality that is here, the two that become one. There are 4 rivers that provide water for the Garden of Eden.
That's right.
We get to chapter 7, we have God providing an ark for the redemption of Noah and his wife. And then the waters flood the earth. In chapter 12, see there's 2, 7, 12, 17, 22, 27, 32, 37, 42, 47. These are the Exodus chapters of Genesis that follow the Exodus design. So in chapter 7, God provides the ark. In chapter 12, God provides a promised land for the redemption of Abraham and his wife. And God establishes a covenant of grace. And chapter 17...
You know, let me just interrupt here. On chapter 12, talking about Abraham being called, you know, he was called across the waters. He came from Ur of the Chaldees to the Promised Land, and he had to cross the river to do it. And that's where the name Hebrew comes from. Hebrew means someone from the other side of the river. So he had to cross the river into the Promised Land, which is in keeping with this theme, by the way.
So we have the 4 rivers that run through Eden. We have the waters that covered the earth in the flood of Noah. And now we have Abraham, the man who's from across the other side of the river.
That's right.
And so the idea of the water here is really fascinating, especially when we have a husband and wife mentioned, and they produce a son. And Jesus said, you know, you're born of the water and of the Spirit.
That's right.
So we have the fleshly birth that seems to be a transition here, a crossing from one to the other. In chapter 17, which is also an Exodus chapter, God provides blessings, a covenant, new names, a promise for the son of Abraham and Sarah. He says, I'll make my covenant between me and thee and multiply thee exceedingly, but my covenant will I establish with Isaac. And then in chapter 22, we have another Exodus chapter. God provides a substitute sacrifice for the redemption of Isaac. It's amazing. Redemption, redemption, substitute, substitute.
Right.
This is the theme of these chapters.
As a matter of fact, the Exodus, the theme of the Pentateuch, or the Torah, is that of rescuing the people, taking them out of Egypt, moving across the water to a new location.
Of the Red Sea.
The Red Sea.
Yes.
And so we find this theme all the way through these Exodus chapters located in the first book.
In chapter 27, God provides Isaac's blessing for Jacob. Isaac tells Esau, thy brother came with subtlety and hath taken away thy blessing. Jacob prepares for his journey to fetch a wife. It's amazing. In chapter 2, it's Adam and his wife. In chapter 7, it's Noah and his wife.
That's right.
In chapter 12, it's Abraham and his wife. And in chapter 17, it's Abraham and Sarah.
That's right.
You know, chapter 22, it's a substitute for Isaac. And then in verse 18 and following, in the last part of that chapter, Abraham receives family news of Rebekah's birth. She's to be the coming wife of Isaac. So we had to have the wife in there, you know.
That's right.
And in 27, God provides blessings for Isaac, and for Jacob, and Jacob then sets out on his journey to fetch a wife. In chapter 32, he provides a new name for Jacob, and the journey home brings God's blessings. He wrestles with the man throughout the night, you know, and then he says, bless me, and he changes his name from Jacob to Israel, a prince with God.
And by the way, he's headed for his new home, and that's the theme of this, the husband, the wife, and the home.
Right. And the fact that he is redeemed with a new name. That's redemption, you see. He's been born again, so to speak. Been given a new name. And in chapter 37, another Exodus chapter, God provides for the safety of Joseph by sending him into Egypt. You know, Jacob loves his son, gives him a coat of many colors, gives him God gives Joseph a dream of leadership for the redemption of the family, and then the brothers beat up on him and cast him into the pit, and he eventually then gets to go down into Egypt to escape the trauma that he's experienced with his brothers. So God's redemption in every chapter. In chapter 42, another Exodus chapter, God provides food for Jacob's family down in Egypt, and Joseph plans for the redemption of his brothers. Chapter 47, God provides for the redemption of Jacob's family in the land of Goshen, the very best of Egypt's land. And those are the Exodus chapters, and Gary, they fit the meaning of Exodus perfectly.
They do indeed. And the themes, again, Genesis, beginnings. Exodus is redemption. And we're going to talk about Leviticus next. Leviticus has to do with the Spirit, worship. It has to do with Christ in particular, with Christ as the substitutionary atonement, everything having to do with the spiritual nourishment of God through Christ. And of course, the book of Leviticus is full of the typology of Christ.
Yeah.
So now, starting with the 3rd chapter of Genesis, we'll look at these Leviticus-themed chapters in Genesis.
And guess what God does in chapter 3?
What does he do?
He offers a sacrifice.
Ah, yes.
And he clothes Adam and Eve with the skins of this sacrificial animal. You see, there's the spiritual dimension, the worship, the sanctification, God's holiness, communication with God. Just as in the book of Leviticus, we have the establishing of liturgy and the worship at the tabernacle and the Levitical priesthood.
And guess what else he did in Leviticus, the Leviticus chapter? Genesis 3:16, unto the woman he said, I will greatly multiply thy sorrow and thy conception. And as he begins to talk about these things, J.R., he's really prophesying of the redemption of man through Christ.
Yeah, the seed of the woman, the serpent's head.
The seed of the woman.
Isn't that amazing?
And that,
the first promise of the coming Messiah is in the Leviticus chapter.
And one of the sub-themes of Leviticus is the planting of the seed and the nourishment until it's completely ripe. That is, the seed of redemption finally blossoms forth in the righteous man.
Yeah. So, in Genesis, the Leviticus chapters are 3, 8, 13, 18, 23, 28, 33, 38, 43, and 48. And it has the same theme. It follows very carefully the same theme. You know, in chapter 3 we had God offering the sacrifices. Listen to chapter 8. Noah builds an altar and offers sacrifices. Chapter 13, Abraham returns to Bethel and the altar, and he calls on the name of the Lord. In chapter 18, Abraham worships the Lord, and the Lord appeared unto him in the plains of Mamre, and Abraham prays to God for the salvation of Sodom. Absolutely the same subject. Chapter 23, Sarah dies at Hebron, and Abraham mourns for her, and he buys this cave for a gravesite and buries Sarah in the cave of Machpelah. And Gary, this is the hope This is the blessed
Yes, it
hope.
is. The hope of
when this
eternal
life is over,
As a matter of fact, the cave of Machpelah, Hebron today, one of the most disputed places on planet Earth, it is still owned by the heirs of Abraham, and it looks forward to the kingdom.
Sacred site.
Yes, it is.
And that's what Leviticus is all about, the sacred site. Chapter 28, Jacob worships God at Bethel. And chapter 33, Jacob meets Esau and he erects an altar, goes to Jerusalem, buys a parcel of land, erects an altar. There it is again, the establishment of worship. We'll have to save these last three for our next program. As you can see, we've got a lot more to cover in 50 chapters than we could possibly cover. Let's wrap it up with some really neat analogies here.
Well, the interesting thing about this design, J.R., to me, is that as you find the design of the Torah expressed internally in the structure of Genesis, it tells you one thing: no man or group of men wrote the Bible or the Torah.
That's right.
It was written by God. No man could put things together in this complex fashion.
Now, we have had theologians write about Pentateuchal designs before.
Yes, we have.
But not on the 50 chapters of Genesis. This is something new. This is something nobody's ever seen before. And we're bringing it to you. Shall we say the cutting edge? We're on the cutting edge here.
And we have yet to look at the Numbers and the Deuteronomy section. Numbers, of course, is speaking of the journey through the wilderness, which is every man's experience. And Deuteronomy, coming into the kingdom or coming into heaven and receiving the work that you have laid up in heaven. In this life. And J.R., this theme is seen repeated over and over again.
That means that this theme of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy are so divine and so otherworldly and so metaphysical and so powerful that they have a special meaning, which we'll have to look at later. We'll be back.